Good evening, buonasera everybody, buonasera.
Buonasera. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I really can't see out, so I...
Yeah, neither can I, which is probably for the better.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm delighted to be talking to Giuseppe this evening. Being a person in the food world who develops recipes and writes about food, I often get asked what food TV I watch, and my answer to people is always, I watch the Tennis Channel. However, I've always made one exception, and that's my family and I have always watched every season of The Great British Bake Off.
That's the right answer.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, and I don't know, we were drawn to it by, it's beautifully filmed, that lovely little bespoke kitchen, or I guess the tent, the kitchen in the tent. Anyway, when Giuseppe won in 2021, it was a thrill for our Italian-American family. So I'm excited to talk to you, and I guess I want to start a little bit with your background. I'd love for people to know where you come from. I mean, you've lived in Great Britain for a long time, but you grew up in Italy, right?
That's correct. So I was born in Rome, but I was born in Rome simply because my hometown didn't have a hospital back in the 70s. So my mom had to drive all the way to Rome to to be assisted. My hometown is Gaeta, which is a very tiny coastal town between Rome and Naples. It's a lovely place to go back on holiday. I get very cheap holidays because obviously I've still got my bedroom at Mama's place, and I've got there, my mom waiting to feed us as a proper Italian mother, myself and my kids, obviously. So it's a lovely place to go back to. But I left home when I was 18. I moved to Tuscany, to Pisa, another beautiful spot in Italy. And I spent there a few years for my first degree in chemical engineering. And then from there, I moved to the UK. And I have to say that I've never actually decided to move to the UK or to live abroad. It's never been like a conscious decision. For me, it's been more of an organic thing that happened, mostly because I'm perhaps too lazy to make life-changing decisions, and I just wait for somebody to come up with a proposal for the future. So I ended up doing a PhD there, and then after the PhD, started an academic career. Then another job came after that, and I remember vividly that back in the days I used to say, I'm going to stay here only for a couple of years just to perfect my English, and then I'll go back home.
And then 20 years later, there
20 years later, three British children later, I'm still living there. So I've stopped making plans. I would have never thought 2 years ago that I would have dropped my engineering career. So the one thing that is for sure, I'm not planning anything. I'm just seeing.
Well, I want to go back to your early days because you grew up with a dad who was a chef and a baker, right? And so is that where your love of baking came from? I mean, have you always loved baking, or is it something that you were around growing up, but you didn't really find a passion for it until later?
I think probably the second is closer to what it was. The reality is that I was lucky enough to have a dad that was a professional chef and a passionate baker. So he's never had a pasticceria or a bakery himself, but he used to work for cruise ships, and he used to be a head pastry chef on the Costa cruise ships. If you don't know who Costa is the big cruise ship that tilted over in front of Venice. Thankfully, my dad had left the company by that point. So he did that for over almost 30 years, and then he started catering for kids in school. So he's always been in the profession of cooking, and he also did all the cooking at home. So you got this idea of Italians, mamas cooking for everybody. My mom never did any of the cooking. She did all the eating at home.
Interesting.
But none of the cooking. It was my dad that has always been cooking for everybody. But he's never taught me anything because he was an exceptional baker. He was a terrible, terrible teacher. I've asked him once to teach me how to make a creme pat, and while I was pouring milk into the pan, I spilled a little, and he went, I left. So everything that I've learned from him, I've learned silently watching. Osmosis, is absorbing and observing. But the thing is that I think that's the hardest bit to learn in reality, because when I then started to do more baking myself. And that actually happened when I moved out of the house, because I was missing all the weekly cakes that I would get from him for free. And I said, I'm going to have to start doing it myself. And I wanted to, gather the information off him. And I asked him questions, and his answers were always along the line, oh, well, you'll see when it's done. How long do I bake it for? When it smells right. How much flour do I add to my pizza dough?
There's that Italian term, portare a cottura,
or there is
cook it until it's done.
Another one which is even more tragic than that, Domenica, which is quanto basta.
Quanto basta, QB.
QB, you see these recipes and says salt QB, which means quanto basta, and that means as much as it's needed. And you're like, how on earth am I supposed to know how much is needed? I was having this discussion with Eugenio Massari, which is a very famous pastry chef that I had the fortune to meet in London. And in my first book, there is a recipe for Amaretti.
Yes.
Crunchy
Amaretti.
The crunchy Amaretti.
Yeah, so those are the little crunchy almond cookies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they are very easy, because it's just 3 ingredients in there: sugar, almonds, and egg whites. When I looked up my dad's recipe, he had the quantity of almonds, the quantity of sugar, and no quantity for egg whites. And I said, Papa, how much egg whites? Well, you see, the texture needs to be right. When it's just slightly thicker than a creme pat is right. And I'm like, how can I write that in a book?
Yeah.
How can I tell people? Yeah. So I had to test it a gazillion times until I got the right.
But it is a good way to learn, right? Because you have to learn that texture. You have to learn the visuals. You have to learn how it feels. And sometimes that makes you a more intuitive cook or baker.
And I think that that's the most important piece of heritage I got from Dad.
Yeah.
Because he never, as I said, he never gave me, the techniques or the things that you would imagine a chef would give you when actively teaching.
Right.
But I got from him when the cake smells right, or when the pizza dough is the right texture. So all those things that is difficult to write in a book, he passed them on unwillingly, perhaps, but he did. But going back to your question, I was lucky enough to have not just him in my surroundings, but also an entire family of exceptional chefs and bakers. The funny thing, Domenica, is that I was so surrounded by people with exceptional skills that when I was a kid, I was convinced that it was the same everywhere. And I never really considered cooking or baking a skill the same way you wouldn't consider reading a skill, because everybody does it, so it's not a talent, surely. And I thought that was the case. It took me, I had to get into adulthood to realize that it's not such a common
Then when you left home and had to start making the cakes yourself. Yeah. I want to get into your books and obviously also the experience with the Great British Bake Off. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Italian baking in general, because I sort of feel that Italian baking has kind of suffered, at least in this country, from a reputation of, like dry cookies, stale nuts, and liquor-soaked sponge cake, right? When it's so much more than that. I don't know if it's suffered the same way in the UK. Now, I feel like this perception has changed and is evolving, and that there's much more of an appreciation for it. But, and I think in part because people like you are kind of bringing forth what Italian pasticceria really is. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, what you consider Italian baking, what is special about it, what is unique about it. How do you define it?
How long have you got? I would say that, well, the first thing I would say, Domenica, is that there isn't one Italian baking, the same way there isn't one Italian cuisine.
Right.
And very often Americans joke about the fact that America is a very young country and everything here is brand new compared to old Europe. Italy is only 160 years old, so it's much, much younger as a country than America is.
Right.
As a whole country, obviously. And before that, it was just a collection of small kingdoms and, the papal state, etc. And that translates to these days into a very eclectic mix of cultures and backgrounds and traditions, to the point that if we mentioned Tuscany earlier on. I found it very, very funny that I lived in Pisa, and Livorno is literally 5 miles away.
Yeah.
The two cities are so parochial, it's unreal, because they come from two different republics back in the days, and there is still that massive competition between them, which is obviously these days a very positive, and it's almost a joke, but they've got identical foods, just called differently, with identical recipes, and each city is adamant that they have got the right recipe.
Well, Italians aren't opinionated at all.
Not at all.
No.
Not at all. Not at all.
No, but you and I were talking about mostaccioli earlier.
Yes.
Mostaccioli is a spice cookie, usually enrobed in chocolate, and it's found in various regions, mostly southern Italy, but I have an old Italian baking book that I think had a recipe from Friuli, way up in the north, or somewhere up there, Lombardia maybe. But so it's a spice cookie, and it's very popular at Christmas time. And I just posted a recipe for one from the region of Abruzzo, where my family is from. And in Giuseppe's new book, you've got a recipe for mostaccioli, which is so different from mine. I mean, the flavors are somewhat similar, but his is more like a filled cookie. They end up being the same shape. If you go to the American Midwest, mostaccioli is a baked pasta dish.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. So, and that's because you use penne pasta, or what my dad used to call pencil points, and it's kind of got that rhombus shape, and the mostaccioli cookies also have that rhombus shape, so somehow it translated to this pasta dish. So that's the wonderful, confusing world of an Italian.
So that's the thing. There isn't a single reference point, but depending on where you are or what you're referring to, which region you're in, which city you're in, almost which family you're in. If you go to Siena and ask, when I was looking for the recipe for ricciarelli, which is an almond cookie typically baked in Siena, I asked 3 or 4 friends, Senesi, for their recipes. They came back with 3, 4 different recipes, and each one of them claimed that was the original. So it's very difficult to understand which one to go for, and I'm assuming that's the beauty of it, because it gives you a massive repertoire of options, and the whole language is articulated vastly into small nuances. In the UK, very little of that arrived. I suppose that perhaps I'm certain, I was in a grocery store before coming here today, and the selection of cured meat and cheeses, Italian cheeses, that you have in your grocery shops, I can only find in 1 or 2 department stores in London, probably because of the old Italian immigration
because in Washington, D.C., we don't have it.
There you go. There you go. But when I moved to the UK 20 years ago, it was difficult to find mozzarella. You couldn't find it everywhere.
Right.
Now it's in every supermarket. But back in the days, there were only a couple of supermarkets that stocked it, and not always. So the idea of Italian baking in the UK is probably panettone, I would say, and very few other things, to the point that whatever I proposed on the show was welcomed as a very almost exotic thing. And to me, that sounded so strange. And people kept asking me, so Giuseppe, are you bringing in more of your Italian flavors? And I was like, I'm not bringing in anything. This is the only thing I know to bake.
Right.
This is all I know. I'm not doing it on purpose.
Well, I want to talk, we'll get to GBBO, but I want to talk a little bit about your books, because you've written 2 beautiful books on Italian baking. Your first one, Giuseppe's Italian Bakes, and your new one, Giuseppe's Easy Bakes. And they're both filled with a mix of traditional recipes, some historic recipes, some of your own creations, but they're quintessentially Italian in flavor. And in your first book, you had some real showstoppers. It's like a rum baba, which is not easy to make, but is really wonderful. And we were talking about bonnet, which is a dessert from Torino. It's like a caramel custard, but it has crushed amaretti in it. I've not made it yet, so tell us a little bit about.
It's like a rustic flan, if you like. So because it's got blitzed amaretti into the butter, and then the whole thing sets because of the egg yolks. And the original recipe only calls for yolks, not whites. So you can add whites. It makes it slightly more. It's easier to make because it sets easier, obviously, but it sort of goes slightly towards rubbery a little, whereas with the yolks only, it stays creamy. Very creamy and soft. I'm salivating. Sorry about it. It's delicious. It's really, really nice. But that's
so that's in your first book. In your second book, I guess I want to say the recipes for the most part are simpler, but I don't want to confuse that with ordinary or simplistic, because they really aren't. They have lovely flourishes and interesting, flavor combinations. I mentioned to you earlier that there's a recipe in here for a lovely walnut cake that has Marsala-soaked sultana raisins in it, and that really is just calling my name, those flavors. And by the way, I wrote about Marsala recently. I think it needs to make a comeback because it's such a wonderful fortified wine, and there's some really good versions being made now, and it's such a good baking ingredient.
And also those dry biscuits that you mentioned earlier that Italian baking is famous for. If you dip them in Marsala, they are not dry any longer.
Exactly.
They will be perfect for.
They have a purpose.
They do. They really do.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Well, you mentioned their simplicity, and the one thing that sort of concerned me when I came up with the concept of this book was I tried to visualize it, and I was concerned that all the bakes would look the same. Because when you've got simple bakes, there are no celebration cakes in there. They're just simple sponges, single layer sponges, perhaps with a selection of sauces that you can pick and choose to combine them with. But they are just sponges. And when I was talking to the editor, I was like, is it going to be looking dull or uninteresting? When I started doing the research and I put together some photos to see what it would look like, I was like, there is nothing uninteresting about this. This is beautiful. This is great. And then you realize that simple doesn't mean simplistic, and rustic doesn't mean ugly necessarily.
Right.
They are actually, if I can't achieve much with a single book, but if I can nudge the idea that simple is good and rustic should be respected for what it is without any particularly complicated decoration on top, that's, I'd be very, very pleased with that.
Yeah, and you and I talked a little bit earlier about this concept of beautiful bakes, beauty in baking, and there is, to me, something really beautiful about a plain Italian cake. One of my favorite Italian cakes to make is an apple cake, and I make a different apple cake every fall because I think there are as many apple cakes as there are cooks or bakers in Italy. They're like a thumbprint almost. Yes. Every nonna or mama has her own version of apple cake, and you even have a version.
That's
of
my grandmother's apple cake.
Yeah. And to me, there's something beautiful about this cake that comes together with so few ingredients, and I don't know. I don't think it needs piped roses or fancy frosting or whatever to be a beautiful bake.
Well,
there
is a time and a place for everything. The thing is that I'm not a big fan of spending 4 or 5 hours beautifying a cake. That's the thing, and I'm not saying that is wrong. If you like doing it and if you've got the skills, by all means go for it. That's not the side of baking that I enjoy the most doing. Let's put it that way. I'd rather spend time doing something that makes the cake particularly tasty. So, for example, rather than cutting corners and using ground almonds bought at Costco, which are perfectly fine, and I use them all the time. But if I have the opportunity to use maybe some almonds that my in-laws have picked from their trees, and you toast them at home, you peel them at home, and then you make ricciarelli with that. I mean, they look exactly the same as the ones that you would make with ground almonds, but the taste is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that, I think, applies especially to Italian baking, because the same as with Italian cuisine, the list of ingredients is really small. You've mentioned baba earlier, one of my favorite cakes. It's got like 4 or 5 ingredients.
So tell, for people who might not know what baba is.
Yeah. Baba effectively is the Italian version of a savarén. It's a yeasted, enriched dough with a lot of butter, so it's very rich, very flavorsome, and it's particularly tedious to make, not difficult, but long, because it's very similar to panettone in terms of structure. It's made with a very high protein flour, because you need to create a very strong gluten network, because it rises.
Yeah, rises.
Proves a lot.
Yeah.
With you add yeast in it, the same that you would add when you make pizza, effectively, and you have got to mix it and work it for a long time in order to transform those proteins into gluten, which is what is going to hold the whole structure up. Now, back in the days when my dad did it, he did it by hand. And it was horrendous because it was my mom's favorite cake. So every December, my mom's birthday is on the 6th of December, so in a few days, he would make baba for her. And he would use the hand like this with the bowl under his arm and kept beating it for, I kid you not, half an hour to 45 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, his bicep was this size and he could do it. Yesterday, I made a cake without a mixer. I mean, mixing 2 eggs for 30 seconds, I was already knackered. Yeah. I mean, clearly, that gene didn't pass on to me. But when you do it with a mixer, with a KitchenAid, okay, it takes a long time, but the machine does all the job. Yeah. I mean, once you know how to make it, it's not that difficult. But it is phenomenal. And in itself, it's a really simple cake. Yeah. It's just a donut-shaped cake that you soak in a syrup made with lots of citrus and lots of rum as well, lots of sugar. You soak it all entirely, and in its most simple shape, that's it. Yeah. It's just a soaked sponge. Then you can beautify it with some chantilly cream, some fresh fruit, and it becomes really a proper centerpiece. Yeah. I mean, it's a regal thing to put in the middle of the table. Yeah. You don't do it every day.
Well, what I like also in your book is the recipes are simple, but I think maybe you snuck in a few that aren't quite as simple, but I like that because you have a recipe for pear and prune strudel, and
but it's simple,
I feel
right?
like, well, you do give people an out because you say you can use store-bought pastry. Yeah. But I feel like so many people are intimidated by the thought of baking and, oh my gosh, I'm never going to make a strudel dough. But you give them the instructions for how to do it. And I think, I teach pasta classes, and people are so intimidated by the idea of making pasta. But when you roll up your sleeves and do it yourself, it really changes you, and you become more confident. Yeah. And so I think having recipes like that in there is good, because people need to embrace baking, and just because you have to roll out a dough really thin doesn't mean you can't do it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that from that, we mentioned earlier the lack of instructions I had from my dad, and that is probably the reaction to that. So I'm trying to give into the recipes that are right, all the information so that everybody can get it right the first time they try it. And also, can I just say something also in that space? I mean, perfection is overrated, yeah?
Yes.
So when you're making a cake yourself, even if it doesn't look as pretty or as fabulous as it does on the book, there is the IKEA effect, isn't there? I mean, you've done it yourself, therefore it's going to taste good for sure. Yeah. It's like that, the Billy bookcase that you put together yourself.
Yeah.
It might be made out of cardboard, but you put it together yourself, so it's going to be good anyway. Right. And there is that element that shouldn't be underestimated. And there is a lot of self-gratification that goes into making something. In fact, I make lots of cakes and biscuits, but I don't have a sweet tooth. I don't eat them. I like to make them, and the making them is the part. Well, but I love pizza though. That's my Achilles heel. But I love the process. So if you start thinking less of what the end results should look like and try to savor the process of doing it, I think that's what makes me want to do complicated bakes.
Yeah.
Because I enjoy making them. And even if you get them wrong, I mean, how wrong can they be?
Exactly. And it's like muscle memory. The more you do it,
Yeah.
the more you
Yeah.
understand it. It's like becoming an intuitive cooker or baker.
Yeah,
I
precisely.
think it, well, I guess let's move on to the bake-off, the Great British Bake-Off. I'm sure there are people who want to know lots of...
We should call it the baking show in the US.
The Great British Baking Show, is
Yeah.
that what we call it here? I'm
Oh, well,
so used to
apparently-
calling it Bake-Off now.
Well, but apparently, this is something I didn't know, but apparently the reason why this got two different titles is because Bake-Off in the US is something different, trademarked for something different.
Oh, the Pillsbury Bake-Off. That's probably
Yeah.
why. So
Yeah, so they
Pillsbury
come
is,
up
you
call
know
it
what
that.
Pillsbury is?
No.
It's a company. What do they make? Poppin' Fresh Dough is all I remember.
Okay.
I'm dating myself. So they make boxed cakes
Okay.
and products, but they've been around for many, many years in the U.S. and they had a yearly competition called the Pillsbury Bake Off.
There you go.
And I think it could catapult housewives to fame when their cakes were chosen or whatever.
Wow.
I don't know if I'm remembering that correctly.
It was very weird because when we were filming it, the presenters had to say the same thing twice because obviously we were doing it for both markets. Yeah, so they would say, and welcome to the Great British Bake Off, and then after 5 seconds, and welcome to the Great British Baking Show. So you've got both versions in the same spot.
So that's pretty funny. So I want to, let's get into a little bit into the process of how you got onto it. What made you decide that you wanted to try out for this show, and what was that process like?
So, well, we were discussing earlier, Domenica, weren't we, that one of the reasons why I had to leave the country was that I'm not into football at all. And I think I'm probably one of the 4 Italians in the world that are not into football at all. And I've never understood people that would shout at TV supporting their football team. And then I found myself doing exactly the same while
and
watching
by
the show.
football, he means soccer.
Oh, sorry, I should have said. Damn. And I find myself doing exactly the same while watching the baking show. And I'm like, take it out of the oven, you're burning it, you're overworking it. And I become the best coach, obviously, the best baker ever. So I was and I still am, a massive fan of the show. I'm a big bake-off nerd. You name the baker, I can tell you exactly which season they were in, why they went out, which episode they left, everything.
Ian, or was it Ian? Ian. Who was the guy that
Ian.
left in the middle of the show and never came back?
There were more than one. This is the Alaska, the baked Alaska gate you're talking about. Yes, yeah. In Britain, it's a big thing. I mean, it was discussed in the parliament, so it's that big. Anyway, so I was a big supporter of the show, and my kids were as well. So they know the Bake Off very well. It's the only show that they are allowed to stay up longer on a Tuesday evening to watch.
So 3 kids, right? 3 boys. Yeah.
Yes, and the idea actually was from my eldest because his birthday is in August, and this was during the pandemic, so it was 2020. I made birthday cake for him on the beginning of August. He tried it and he gobbled up and it was, Papa, this is delicious. You should be on Bake Off. And I was like, you might be onto something there. I never thought about that. But then I waited until everybody was out of the house because I was ashamed of it entirely. I filled in the application form online, but you have to film 60 seconds reel of yourself. You don't have to, but they strongly recommend you do that. So I waited until everybody was out of the house, and I filmed it in front of my Kenwood, 59 seconds sharp, obviously, the engineer and me talking.
Yeah.
I sent it over, and I was called immediately, like a week later. The application closed at the beginning of December, and I sent out mine at the end of November, so at the very last minute. And they called me back immediately. At that point, I thought I should tell my wife at least, because otherwise things can be complicated. So I did tell her, and it went on. It's a multi-stage selection process. I think that when when I applied, they got more than 10,000 applications.
Oh my goodness.
And it started in November and it went on all the way until March 2021. And on my sister's birthday, they called me on the 25th of March. That's why I'll never forget, to say, you're one of the 12, you're going to be in the tent. And it was very funny because the lady that I met later, Sophia, she was, are you okay? Because I was stunned. There was stunned silence because I was computing, I was processing. I was, yeah, I'm okay. Well, so what are you going to say? I said, well, I don't know. What do you need from me? Yes? Do you need a yes? And she said, well, the people have been crying, people have been screaming, people have been telling, no, this is a joke, and you're not saying anything. And I was like, sorry.
Speechless.
I was stunned completely. Also because in the meantime, I was trying to explain to my wife with Italian gestures that I made it in the show. So it was my son's idea, effectively, and I did it on a whim, never in a million years expecting to be called back, let alone to be on the show. So it was a big surprise for everybody. To this day, I still pinch myself, if I'm honest. And I'm still thinking, did that really happen?
Yeah.
Did I dream all of that?
Because you haven't watched it, right?
I watched it only once.
Okay, you watched it once.
I don't think I can get myself to watch it.
So, but you were on during you went during the pandemic, so it was it must have been an even more surreal experience than it would have been otherwise. Tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Yes, it was, I feel very guilty by saying this, but the reality is that I couldn't have done it any other way. So the only reason why I managed to be on the show and to apply for it and to make it through the selection process was because we were in a pandemic, because I had the time. I was working from home. We were in lockdown, so I had the time to, like many, I avoided shaving, showering, changing. So I had plenty of spare time, and I could bake, to my heart's content, like I'd never been able to do before. And that's what gave me the chance to bake a lot and take photos. That's the other thing. The production wanted proof that you could do what you said you could. And I am no millennial by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm not one of those that would bake anything and stick it on Instagram. I didn't even have an Instagram account back then. So I didn't have photos. I had to bake, to shoot photos and send them to production to prove that I could do what I said. So I'm glad that I did it in that context. Also because we were filming in a lockdown, so we were all swabbed and tested and everything. Getting into the hotel room, or the hotel grounds where we were filming, and we couldn't leave. We couldn't have any interaction with the external world until we were eliminated. So the guys were sent out, and
so
then
it
they
was
would
a
leave.
real bubble. Yeah.
It was a real bubble, absolutely. Although coincidentally, Paul Hollywood's wife or spouse came in and left.
Oh,
Is this being recorded by anyone? This is not being broadcast anywhere, is it?
Oh, no. This is just between us.
Excellent. So yeah, we couldn't have any interaction with them. I stayed there 7.5 weeks. But the thing is that the way they do it now, the way they've always done it, is that the bakers go on site on a Friday night. They shoot on Saturday and Sunday, 2 days of shooting for the one episode, and then they go back home on a Monday.
Okay.
Imagine going back on a Monday home, finding your full-time job, 3 kids, the family, the swimming pool, the taekwondo, the piano lesson, the violin lesson. I couldn't have done it. I mean, just getting ready when I was designing the bakes, I had to do it between 9 in the evening and 2 o'clock in the morning after the kids were in bed. So, getting ready for the show whilst having a family and a job life would have been absolutely impossible. Whereas in the tent, I had to take, obviously, all my holidays, unpaid leave, and thankfully I had a very understanding employer that didn't make a fuss. I had to stay there 7 weeks, but for me it was heaven, Domenica. I mean, imagine we were in a hotel in beautiful grounds, okay, surrounded by, you imagine the quintessential British countryside. green everywhere, brooks running through the area, squirrels everywhere, birds everywhere, Mary Poppins popping out. It was really, really idyllic. We were fully catered. People would clean your room. All we had to do was wake up, go in the practice tent where the production had set up, where you could practice the bakes before the show. And we had exactly the same equipment. There were 12 stalls with the same equipment that you would find in the tent.
So you could practice the bakes, but you couldn't practice the one under the gingham,
the technical,
right?
no, you never know. You never know what it is. You could practice only the signature and the
because they have to obviously condense everything for the episode, so we're only really seeing little snippets of what it was like. What was the judging really like? Was it longer than?
Yeah, much longer. So the first thing is that after there is a lot of time of waiting that you've got to go through, because once you've finished your bake, the tent is cake carnage.
Well, I was going to say your stations weren't magically cleaned up in 5 seconds.
I mean,
like
I
Mary
remember
Poppins
vividly on the week one, I was behind Christelle, which was one of the finalists in my year. She was just in front of me. We were making our showstopper, and I was focused on my task, so I didn't look around that much. That's the other thing. Whilst you are in the tent, you have no idea what's happening around you. So that look of surprise that you see on people when they are star baker or not, or eliminated, it is a true surprise, because you have no idea how you have done compared to others, because you don't know the others, how the others have done. So it wasn't. I didn't see what the others were doing. I was concentrating on my bake. Then I look up, and there was a waterfall of white chocolate ganache coming down off the stool behind the bench. And I was like, Christelle, how? I mean, not even on the worktop, on the stool. So that's the level we are talking about. Yeah. And there is a swarm of 30 plus bake-off elves that come from behind the sunburst at the bottom of the tent, and they clean everything up. And I wouldn't want to have their job to save my life, because they have to move your bakes. So they have to move them, clean under it, and put them back. And you can see them, they're shaking, like 3 of them holding it up. Horrible job to have, a horrible job to have.
Oh my gosh.
So there is a long waiting before everything is cleaned up. Then the judging takes a long time, because the judges have to give enough materials during their judging for the editors to be able to cut meaningful snippets. So they tell you similar things in 400 different ways.
Oh, okay.
So which is okay when the feedback is good.
Yeah.
But if the feedback is bad, and you've got Paul Hollywood telling you 10 times that your sponge is, stodgy, and you're like, okay, get the message, move on. So it's a bit difficult to cope with, but it's a long process, especially at the beginning when you've got 12 bakers with 12 bakes to judge. We started filming at 6:30 in the morning all the way to 7 o'clock in the evening, so they were very long days.
Yeah. So, did you ever feel like you wanted to punch Noel or Matt?
No.
Because I would have.
They are considerate. So if they see that you are struggling, they do say, Giuseppe, shall I move away? The thing, they are very different from what you see on TV, I would say, because, first of all, Noel is really surreal, very surreal, and I don't find him funny. So it's a sweet guy, it's a lovely guy, but I just didn't.
Different humor.
Yeah, different humor. Yes, he's very British and very strange. Whereas Matt, I loved. I grew up in an English way with Matt. He was part of the duo with David Walliams, and most of the English I learned it through them through Little Britain, which is a quite potty-mouthed show to learn English from. So I had to tone it down a little in my academic years. But no, I never found them particularly annoying. Actually, there is a good anecdote that I can tell you if you like with Matt specifically.
Yes.
The one thing that I've learned while being on the show is that they mic you up, so you've got the microphone like this, and they listen to you throughout the day, whether you are in the tent or out of the tent. So one of the, this was towards the end, I don't remember exactly which episode it was, we had an interaction with Matt, and I wasn't responding very energetically, let's put it that way, so I was a bit slumped. So we were out of the tent, we have finished the bake, and Matt approached me. He's an adorable guy, honestly. He's the sweetest man you can possibly imagine. So he came to me and said, Giuseppe, are you okay? Because he didn't seem very reactive. Is everything okay? And I said, well, Matt, I'm not sleeping much because, I was very nervous. I'm a planner, and for me it was difficult to cope with the idea that I was going to be on national television and potentially making a fool out of myself. So it wasn't easy, yeah? And I told him, I'm a warrior. I worry a lot, and I'm not sleeping much. The following day, the executive producer of the show, Jenna, she came to me and she said, oh, Giuseppe, I've heard that you're not sleeping. How do you know that? And she said, well, I was listening to the microphone. And
my gosh.
In that split second, I recapped everything that I'd ever said in the previous 12 weeks in the tent. I was like, did I ever say anything offensive to these people? Thankfully, hopefully not. But she was so nice that she bought me a card that says, be a warrior, not a warrior.
Oh, nice.
And behind it, she wrote in Italian, she said, dai che ce la fai, which means, come on, you can do it. And it's been framed, and I've got it in my home. So that's the level of support we got in there. So to answer your question, no, they were not annoying. Actually, Matt was actually quite supportive.
That's wonderful. We've got some questions from the audience, and I want to get to those before time is up. So this question is from Rebecca. What is a recipe you enjoy eating, but not so much cooking or baking? From a fellow Italian.
Okay. So one of my favorite cakes that I can happily finish off entirely from start to finish in one session is a pastiera, which is an Easter tart from Naples traditionally, and the filling is very Moorish and very unusual because it's filled with a concoction made with wheat cooked in milk with lots of citrusy flavors, and the signature flavor is orange blossom water. And to me, that's what Easter smells like. And I love it to bits. I'd rather my wife made it, because it's a long process.
My mom used to make it.
Yeah, my wife is much better than mine. So at least that's the line I use, so that she makes it.
Okay, pastiera. Have you had any great Italian food in New York yet?
Big time. So I actually posted about this a couple of days ago. Because
and that's from Katie. Sorry, Katie, yeah.
Yeah, as soon as I arrived, after a long day of traveling, I was eager. So I've got lots of recommendations from people on social media to go and find places. But I looked on TripAdvisor, and I found that there was this very highly ranking pizzeria literally around the corner from the hotel I was staying at. So I thought, I can't jump on a train again to go all the way somewhere special, so I'll just have pizza. And it was perfect, much better than many pizzas I've had in Italy. So, that shows that, good food has got no boundaries, really.
That's great. And have you been able to visit any Italian-American bakeries?
Yes, I looked up one of the what would have been a good Italian bakery in Little Italy.
Oh, yeah.
And I found this place called Ferrara.
Yeah.
And I had a New York cheesecake there, strangely enough, and it was to die for. I would highly recommend it.
Oh,
they had very good cannoli as well. It looked very, the things that they were serving, I think that they could serve easily and equally well if the same place was in Italy. And I think that's a good mark of how good they were.
That's great to hear, yeah.
I'm not getting paid for this, by the way. So.
Okay, so Caroline asks, you said on Bake Off that your wife is a better baker than you. Is there any chance she will be on Bake Off?
Not in the slightest. In fact, if you look it up, you'll never see her face anywhere because she hates the whole concept of showing her face. We film the backstories, which is the bit that they film at home to introduce yourself, and she blatantly refused to be on camera. So nope, you won't see her around unless she changes her mind.
That's unusual these days, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we've done the same with the kids, so we've tried to protect their face and identity. They didn't like it because they said, "Well, we want to be famous." Wait until you're 18 and then you decide whether you want to.
So you have 3 boys, right? Yeah. 3 sons. Are any of them into baking? Do you think any of them are going to follow? Yes, the
eldest is. Annoyingly, because he asks me to bake with him every weekend. And, occasionally I love it, but occasionally I would rather do something else. But no, he's very much into baking. The other 2 are very much like my mom. They're more into eating than into baking.
So are you a cook as well? Do you like to cook?
Oh, yes, big time. The thing is that it's the same thing. Well, now I've got an excuse to bake. And actually, signing up to Bake Off was also done to give myself an excuse to bake because I never had the time to do it and I never had enough justification or motivation to do it as much as I would have liked. And now with cooking is the same. So I love to do it, but I usually start preparing my main meal at 1 o'clock and 10 minutes before it's supposed to be served. So the highest of my cooking exercises these days is fish fingers in the oven or fried eggs with mozzarella.
That's
so
delicious.
I just don't have enough time in the day to do it as much as I'd like.
There's nothing better than fried eggs and mozzarella. With mozzarella,
couldn't agree more.
I love it. Yeah. I'm reading this question, which was literally just the question I asked about whether your sons are going to follow in your footsteps. So that was from Michaela. So do you have a favorite thing to bake with them that you like to bake with them or that they like to bake with you?
Yeah, well, we do often pasta frolla is the traditional short crust pastry done the Italian way, and it's very easy to make. And the kids love doing the rubbing in of the butter, so they like the smell of butter. Well, my eldest does. He's the only one who does that. So we make very often pasta frolla, and they can then turn it into either a tart or crostata, or they make some biscuits. The one thing that we do every year now, it's become a bit of a tradition. In September, lots of you can pick plenty of blackberries in England. It's there everywhere, and they love them. So they pick their own, they make their marmellata, their jam, and then they make a tart with it effectively. It's simple enough for them to do it.
That's my favorite breakfast is a nice jam crostata.
Yeah, who can blame you?
How do you learn to trust yourself as a baker? That's a great question.
I will tell you when I start trusting myself as a baker. I still don't, not at all. I've got a massive imposter syndrome. No, I don't trust myself in the slightest yet.
Well, you recently wrote an opinion piece, an op-ed piece about how you actually are rather insecure, but you feel like it's kind of contributed to your success because it makes you continually try.
Yes.
Oh, can you guys hear me now? Let's see. Hello?
Oh, now it works.
Okay. So you recently wrote an op-ed in which you said you sometimes feel you are kind of insecure as a person, or you have insecurities, imposter syndrome, but you feel like that's kind of contributed a bit to your success. And how is that?
Well, the thing is that when I don't trust myself, therefore I push myself annoyingly far to try and improve whatever I do. And my firm opinion is that if I was more of the type that is very much on fashion these days of kissing your own biceps and patting your own back, I wouldn't be where I am today, because the only reason why I managed to put together bakes that got the praises of the judges is because I worked my socks off I tested them until I was nauseous, and that comes, and the same goes for the recipes that are in the book. So I think that in my case, the fact that I don't trust myself as a baker pushes me to improve what I do and keep looking for the tiniest imperfection. And when you write emails these days, or people, there is this big trend of translating the way you write a text message into the way you write emails or formal emails. So abbreviations, spelling mistakes that would be forgiven in a text message. When I write a text message, I have to read it 3 times before I send it. And if the punctuation isn't right, I won't send it. Yeah. So the one thing that I still have to work out, and if you've got any advice, please do, is how do you marry punctuation with emojis? Because where does the full stop go? Before the emoji or after the emoji? That's something that I've never. After. There you go.
I was an English major. Okay, here's one more question. Have you noticed any interesting similarities between the creativity of baking and engineering?
Big time, yes. In my case, yes, specifically, because my branch of engineering is materials engineering, and the work that I've been doing for a couple of decades was all about developing new materials for high-performing materials for high-performing structures. And the materials that I've played with are composite materials, which are plastics with fibers in it. And the way you make them, you literally bake them. So you've got your mold, you stick your fibers in there, and then you inject your liquid resin and you put it in an oven. And you've got to follow the temperature profile, the ramping and the dwelling at the right temperature for the right time. So I've been doing lots of baking before becoming a baker. But I was baking aircraft wings so they were less palatable, I would say, than cake, and much riskier, because if you screw one of those up, then the repercussions can be serious.
We won't talk about that. Yeah. And that question was from Eric. I just wanted to say that was a good question. Maybe we have time for one more. When I make cantucci, my rolls are always over 2 inches, and they still flatten, but too much. When I make them 1/4 of an inch, they're too small. What am I doing wrong?
So, say that again.
I'm trying to figure this out. When I make cantucci, my rolls, the logs, maybe?
The logs,
are always over 2 inches, and they still flatten, but too much. When I make them 1 1/4 inches, they're too small. What am I doing wrong?
So if they collapse, it could be because it depends. If they're using racing agent, it might be too much. So the original version of cantucci doesn't use any baking powder, but that does deliver very, very hard biscuits.
Vinsanto.
And then you need Vinsanto to soak them in. But the way I make them, at least, I add a small amount of baking powder, just enough to puff them up a little, so that it gives them a little bit of crispiness. So that might be one of the options. However, a 5-inch log is big. You end up with tozzi rather than cantucci. For cantucci, the logs have to be at most 3 centimeters, which is what, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, roughly. Because then when you cut them at 45 degrees, they come out the 5-6 centimeters of 2-3 inches.
But now, of course, you can make the big coffee house biscotti. They can be huge.
Oh, I forget. We're in America, so everything is massive here, isn't it? No, well, cantucci should be this size.
Little bites.
They should fit nicely on your saucer when you have an espresso. So, but then if your coffee is this big, then you do need. Sorry, I don't mean to be disrespectful.
No, and I think nobody would really want a cantuccio that was without the raising agent or maybe a little butter in it to be coffee house size.
But my dad used to make them. They are different. They're called tozzi, and he used to put fat in it. So the real cantuccis are fatless completely. Whereas the tozzi, they are bigger. They use more baking powder and they use some fat. So they are still you don't break your teeth when,
Yeah.
when you bite into them.
So I don't know if we have any more time for another question, or are we? I don't know how we're doing on
I
time.
can't see anything over there. Maybe
I can't
somebody's
either.
telling us to stop, and we don't know.
We'll do one more. As a scientist, are there any scientific processes or chemical reactions in any recipe in your books, or that you've encountered that really make you go, wow?
Wow, I wouldn't go wow, but knowing the physics and the chemistry behind what's happening in the oven helps a lot. For example, let me think, there was one. Which one was that? I think it's the recipe for the lemon crinkle biscuits that is in the book.
Those look really good.
It's super easy to make and very, very lemony. I mean, you've got to be into lemon to like them. There is some lemon juice in the mix and some baking powder. So the way I had to describe how the order in which you add the ingredients has to make sure that the baking powder doesn't mix with the lemon juice immediately, otherwise it'll froth and you will lose all the chemical power of the baking powder. The whole thing will flatten out. So I had to work out a way of adding a sequence of adding the ingredients so that wouldn't happen. So it's a very simple reaction there between acid and alkaline, I think it's called in English.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's, but you know that it's happening and you can work around it, but it's hardly a wow factor.
But it's interesting,
reaction.
and your background obviously was helpful to you.
Yes,
in that
yeah,
case.
well, chemistry helps
yeah.
when you're baking, definitely, there is no doubt.
So, final question for you. You mentioned in that op-ed piece that you wrote that you have been thinking possibly a TV show. Can we hope for that in the future?
That was like the last sentence I wrote.
I read the whole thing.
There you read the whole thing, Domenica. I'm impressed. You survived. You didn't fall asleep halfway through. I'm impressed. Yeah, well, that's probably the one thing that I've learned about myself throughout the whole experience here, both the show and being in the editorial space and having the opportunity to talk to people as we are doing today. I'm a massive introvert. When I do my Myers-Briggs test, and I did them a lot when I was getting trained as a manager, I always came out like 80% introvert and 20% extrovert. But then doesn't mean that I'm shy, clearly. I'm clearly not shy. I've lost a sense of shame entirely. But I've learned that I really like the mechanics behind the show. You've opened this by saying that the Bake Off is a really polished show. It's a nice product. And that is because you mentioned there are 13 cameras on set, shooting for 2 days. So they've got hundreds of hours of footage, and they distill that into 50 minutes of show. Watching how that happens, for me, it's a joy. I mean, the engineering side of me, observing the fact, it's a very simple thing. You know that beauty shot when you see the camera smoothly rolling and the person sitting behind there? It takes hours to do it because they have to install trucks on the floor of the tent on which there is a trolley that the camera moves along and somebody's pushing it up and down. And just, seeing all of that and what happens behind the scenes gives you appreciation of how much work goes into that. And I would love to be part of that. In fact, I've said more than once that if I was 20 years old again, I would probably choose that career, the TV production, because it's such a magical world. You don't see it from the outside. It's a bit like Santa Claus, it's the joy of the magic and the wonder that is kept behind closed doors. So if there is any TV producer here, please give me a shout.
Well, Giuseppe, this has been such a treat for all of us.
My pleasure.
And for me personally, so thank you. Thank you all for coming out. And Giuseppe.
Thank you. Oh my God. I can finally see you.